Well, the day has been passing fairly steadily and I've got a lot of stuff done. I've got all these components clean now. I've already finished doing the shutter and the rangefinder. I've straightened up the slightly bent arms on this struts mechanism and cleaned it, and that's ready to go back in the camera body. So I'm starting to lubricate things. I'm putting a little bit of molybdenum paste on there. Likewise, I'll put a little bit in here where it runs on the rail in the camera body. And molybdenum paste you need very little indeed. Just a smear, just enough to make a dirty mark is usually sufficient. So, to put these struts back in, first I'll put a bit of molybdenum paste on this rod that the shutter release mechanism runs on. That was all that's required. I'll put its spring back in position. I have the transfer shaft here that transfers the action from the cocking rack to the shutter assembly at the front of the camera, and I'll just put a little bit of synthetic grease on the gear of that shaft, and that fits down in the body in this top corner. It sort of tucks down under the last fold of the bellows. That is held in place with this small bracket, so I'll position that in place, and now I've got to get the bellows back into the body without disturbing anything. So I've got to lead that shutter release mechanism onto the shaft. I've lubricated the rear slots in this mechanism. I can lower that in to position. And I managed to do that without disturbing that small bracket that holds the transfer shaft in place, which is good because that needs to be all held in place with these screws. Now I'm wondering why I can't see the hole. What's going on? Is that bracket not far enough over? Quite possibly. Let's try it there. There I have the holes lined up. Now I've got 4 black screws that held the struts mechanism into the body, and the 2 prettiest ones I want to reserve for inside the film cassette well, because that's where people will be able to see them. And the 2 less pretty ones can go in the top and bottom position here, and the ugliest one goes down the bottom under the leather, and I think we'll declare that to be the ugliest one. It's not very ugly. Sometimes that screw is quite mutilated because it's often a fight to actually get it free. So I'll run this screw in, and I'm not doing that up very tight. In the equivalent position at the base of the camera, this spacer has to go in between the struts mechanism and the body. So I'm just lifting the struts slightly with the tip of my tweezers and allowing that spacer to drop into place, and I can see it through here. And our designated ugly screw can go in here, and I'll just get that screw started. That's all that's required. In the film cassette chamber here, the other 2 black screws fit through there. So I'll get that one started. And get its mate started. So I've got all 4 screws in position. Now I can tighten them up. Never tighten the screws up until all of them are in place. Otherwise you'll inevitably find that you can't get the last one in. That's just the way of the world. Now those struts are nice and rigid now. They rattled from side to side quite markedly before, but they're quite good now. That's good. So we've got our struts in place. I've got to put my helical focus mount in here, which I've got all cleaned and ready to go back together. Alright, so here is the focus mount, and I can fit this back in behind the front standard. That's held in place by 4 screws. These screws were loose when we started, and that was the cause of one of the problems this camera had, which was that the focus was prone to sticking. Well, basically the backed out screws were probably were catching on the back of the focus scale ring, I expect. It also meant that the whole shutter and lens assembly were loose on the front standard, so it was not going to be accurately focused at any given time. Not that it likely ever was accurately focusing, because the focus scale ring also showed signs that it had been slipping on the focus helical, and so it was probably inaccurate regardless. So that's back fixed to the front standard. I'm going to close that section up and put in the 4 screws that hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. These are small black screws. And I'll just run those screws up. Doing this with the front collapsed, of course, because the bellows will collapse back to the back of the camera body, and if you tried to do this with the front extended, you've got to have some way of pulling the bellows forward so that the screws would reach. So there we go, the bellows are now connected back up, and the bellows, the tension of the bellows helps stabilise the front of the camera, I would say, to some extent. And our next component is the inner and outer focus helical. Well, these were not aligned with the original alignment marks that an earlier technician had put there. They were at another place altogether. So I decided I will align them with the original alignment marks, and we'll see how we get on. I'm probably going to have to adjust the focus on this helical when I'm done anyway, because I've got no idea where it's going to end up. But we might as well put this back in position in accordance with the lines that an earlier technician had put there, and not the person who had done such a less than fine job of some of the other things I've discovered on this camera. One of the odd things about this camera, I think it's the first time I've seen that film advance lever with the lock components missing from it entirely. It's not uncommon to find cameras with that lock component which locks the film advance when the frame counter reaches number 1. It's not uncommon to find that little lever is broken because some ham-fisted individual has not known that you needed to move the frame counter to unlock it, and has just simply stuck their big fat thumb behind the lever and twisted as hard as they can and snapped the lever. But it's probably the first time I've struck a camera where the part's been completely removed, which would of course disable that mechanism entirely. So this piece goes on here. This is our retainer. I might just put a little bit of wipe of grease on the back edge of that. Doesn't take much, it just needs a touch. And that's held in place with 6 screws, 6 counterhead screws, countersunk head screws. I'll quickly sort through those screws because I want 4 particularly good ones to hold the focus scale ring in position, because we know that one of them had already pulled past the edge of that, which means that the screw head was probably slightly damaged. There's 4 good ones, and in this case it's a lot less important what the screw heads look like. They will hold this retainer ring down regardless. I can see I'm one short. I'll have to have a look in the box of screws and see where I've dropped the last one. All the components are fresh back from the cleaner. Oh, I think I can just about see one right there in front of me. There it is. So it hadn't got far away, it had just bounced out of the container. Check the action. That focus is nice and smooth. That's good. I need to put the focus scale ring back on next. Right, I have my focus scale ring here. Now, you can probably not see, but there are scars here in multiple positions where the screw heads have bitten into it. There's at least 3 sets. One of those sets is probably correct. At the moment the inner helical is far too far in to actually be correct because it's down below the surface of the outer helical, so I know that that's not right. This would be the one possible position, but there's another position here with more marked screw head scars, and I suspect that that's the place to start. So I'm lining up those screw head scars, and with the focus scale ring round at the infinity position, I'll run 4 screws in there. And then I can put on the connecting lever for the rangefinder, which fixes to the inner helical. Don't go mad doing these screws up in a position like this. All you'll achieve is that you will distort the focus scale ring and probably the outer helical and make the focus stiff. All they need to do is hold that ring snug. If the grease is not dried out and nasty, that's all that's going to be required. Nothing more elaborate than that. Here is the focus, the connecting lever for the rangefinder. That's held in with 2 screws here, the inner helical. Oh, interesting, interesting, interesting. Oh, I'm 90 degrees out at this point, which suggests I have put this back in the camera in the incorrect position. So let's just back up. I blame you because I'm working on the camera upside down. Right, quick bit of disassembly. I can see the error of my ways. Basically, I've put that helical back in 90 degrees out. Which is unusual because normally if you put it in the wrong orientation, it does not move smoothly. And I'm looking now to see whether any of these scribed lines are aligned with any marks on this ring. That is one of the screw marked positions, and that does line up an alignment mark right there, which you probably can't see, but I can, and it aligns with screw head marks there. So I think that's probably where I want to be. I'd have to be exceptionally lucky for the focus to be accurate as it stands. However, there are shims on the back of the shutter and lens assembly, and they can be altered to shift the focus point. If, for example, the images for an infinity target came to sharp focus before the focus scale ring had been moved right round to the infinity position, that would indicate that the focus helical was too far back in the camera and more shims would be required, or I would need to alter the position of the focus scale ring on the helical. Normally I would adjust the focus in a case like this if I needed more shims. Usually I would not bother to add more shims, normally I would shift the focus helical. If I had plenty of shims on the lens shutter, and if I needed to adjust it the other way, then I would remove shims if I needed to move the shutter further back to get sharp focus. There are 4 visible screw head marks at this point. And that's where the alignment mark across the inner and outer helical at that point line up. So I think that is possibly the infinity position, or was once upon a time. I'll get these 4 screws back in place. Of course, having only 3 of them is not useful. Where's the 4th one? Way over there. What's it doing there? That looks fine. And I'll get that in place. That's our connection, the connecting arm that couples the inner helical to the rangefinder. And the single screw in here that pulls the arm on the rangefinder forward. And you can see that post moves in and out as I shift the focus. So that part is all good. I'll put the coupling gear and its shroud on the front here, and then we can put the door back on there, I think. Alright, let's see what we can do. This guide needs to go on there. Just checking there was no moisture in here. Apply a little bit of grease to the inside, some to the outside where it runs through this support bush, and a very small smear on the front face where it's retained by the shroud. Drop that into position. Pull the struts up into position. Put this chrome shroud back in place. Now that's popped off, it's lifted off that shaft completely. That's better, it's back in place. Two small screws. Now one of the screws, this one, is visible when you're handling the camera. The other one is tucked down in here where you can't see it. So if you've managed to make a mess of one of those screws, or if somebody before you has managed to make a mess of one of those screws, put the ugly one down at the bottom where it cannot be seen, and keep the pretty screw for where it can be seen. There we have it, that's good. Just checking those struts, they pull up nice and square. That all appears as it should. And I can think about putting the door back on the front. I'm inspecting the door to see what sort of a state it's in. It's dusty and I'm just dealing to that with a stiff paintbrush. In other ways, there's nothing particularly odd about it. The pins, where it couples with these slots on the front standard and pulls the front standard out, a little bit worn looking. They're quite normally a bit worn looking, nothing unusual there. And they lack the washers, the cartridge paper washers, which provide a bit of controlled friction at that point. So I'm going to have to find a pair of washers for those, and then that can go on. But that's looking quite good. I haven't got my hinge screws and washers. I'll get those ready. That's one of the hinge pin screws. There is the other. And there was one washer stray here, which is the washer we want. And I'll figure out where I put that in a second. Time to fit the front door now, so I'll lubricate these front slots on the struts. And these ones here that couple to the door, they're a bit, that bottom one in particular is a bit rough looking. Let's have our door. Apply a bit of synthetic grease here to those two pins. I've seen prettier examples than that. Our fibre washers. One on there. One on there. That's one of our washers. The door. Normally I hook it over at the bottom, stretch it up and over and hook it into the top. Pull it back into position and line up the pins, the pivot pins holes there. Now there were two washers in this case. Typically the larger ones at the top. So I'll put that in place there with one of our two hinge pin screws. Run that screw down. That's good. Flip the camera over. I'm looking at the gap at the bottom to see whether I really need a thicker washer than the one that was used there previously, and I think I probably do. If the washers are missing and they would be beneficial, there'll be rattle in the door, so it won't be as firm as it might otherwise be. Pulling that into place with the tip of my tweezers, lining up that screw hole. If the door's a bit rattly, that's not necessarily a functional impairment for the camera, but it just makes it feel a little bit less, it's not confidence giving, let's say that. So there we go. That opens and closes now. Now the front standard is really good. You know, there's no wobble in that at all. Our focus is smooth. So the main problem that I'd picked with this, now that's been dealt with. So that's good. Our door is all working correctly, and I can assemble the film advanced components. Typically I put all the film advanced componentry in at the bottom of the camera, and there's not much to it, so that I can get this leather glued back down as quickly as possible to stop it being damaged, because it's too prone to accidental damage when it's flapping around like this in the breeze.